morning. Hello. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Cody. I am the youth pastor here, as well as a few other things, kind of do a little bit of whatever Pastor Scott doesn't want to do. And including preaching this morning, which is interesting. Normally I preach when he's gone, but we're going to be doing a little bit more of a rotation these next several months, and we're excited about that. I'm excited for this opportunity. I love doing this, and it's really good to be here with you this morning. And I just want to reiterate a thanks, as Pastor Scott had mentioned, for everybody that was a part of last week's community brunch, Sunday brunch. It was really exciting, and if you missed out, well, I'm sorry, but you missed out. It was really, really good. And for those of you that maybe had some like questions about it, or some like, was that really what we should have done? Is that overwhelmingly we got positive response. If you filled out one of those feedback surveys, thank you so much. That's super helpful. You guys were guinea pigs. This was a pilot project for us, right? We've been talking as leadership about how we can do church a little bit differently and figure out Sunday mornings, how can they look differently? And we talked about so many different options, and then we're like, well, why don't we just do something different when everybody's already here on a Sunday morning, right? So that's kind of what caused us to do that. But we didn't really advertise it. We didn't push it. We didn't want to sell it too much because we wanted to see if we could pull it off first. And I think it was a resounding success. So thank you for those that helped in the kitchen all day Saturday and preparing Sunday morning. It was an amazing, yeah, come on, that's good. And just a couple more thoughts here. If you're one of those people that really struggles with this, don't worry, you're not alone. There's a lot of us that would rather just sit in our pew and not have to talk to other people, and that's okay. But sometimes I think we got to shake that up. There's a lot of people that really love that. There's a lot of people that really like to reach out to that. I want to just share two quick responses to the survey that will hopefully illustrate some of the reasons as to why we do this. All right. Basically, the survey asked a few different, basically rate this morning. That was the first question. Then the second question were what were some of the strengths of this morning. And two people responded by saying these two things. One, how we were able to talk together comfortably and get to know each other with no judgment whatsoever. That's beautiful. The second person said this, and this is I love this so much, and this is why we do it, right? It was my first time attending Grace. I found that not only did the brunch make me feel comfortable with the whole experience of attending a new church, but it also brought me closer with those who invited me. Right, so that's what we're doing this for. We're doing this to shake things up a little bit. We're doing this to do something different. But I also just want to reiterate what Pastor Scott said that morning, that's probably more like church was in the first century than we're doing right now. Right? We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're eating together. And I'm really excited about that. It wasn't just some cool event that we did on a one-off experience. We're going to do that throughout the year on occasion, and it's really intentional to build community. But without further ado, we can do church a little bit normally this morning, and let's get in to the Word of God. I'm actually wrapping up Pastor Scott's sermon series, Potent Parables, and we are going to be looking at a parable in Mark chapter 4 this morning. It's a very interesting parable, and it's one of those parables that I think we've heard a lot, and we kind of have a general consensus of what it means and how to apply it to our lives and how it works in the church life. And interestingly enough, and we'll get into this a little bit, but it's one of the only parables where Jesus actually repeats it. He tells the parable, and then there were some questions, and then he tells the parable again. He's like, okay, dummies, listen up. Here's how it actually is. And we're going to get into that a little bit because that's actually an important part of this parable. But it's really just a beautiful piece of writing, a piece of work that we find in Mark chapter 4. So would you join me in reading Mark chapter 4, starting at verse 1? It's a little bit long, but we're going to get through it this morning. Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake, while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. He taught them many things by parables, and in his teaching said, listen. This is the start of Jesus talking here. Listen. A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came up and ate it. Some fell along rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they were withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants, so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, and some 100 times. Then Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." When he was alone, the 12 and the others around him asked him about the parables. He told them, "The secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables so that they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, and ever hearing but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven." That's a really confusing passage. That's a one for Pastor Scott another time. We're going to skip over that a little bit this morning because it's not really the emphasis of where I want to go. But he's basically quoting out of the book of Isaiah there. And then Jesus said to them, "Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? The farmer sows the word. Some people are like seed along the path where the word is sown. As soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in them. Others, like seed sown on rocky places, hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since you have no root, they last only a short time." Since they have no root, sorry. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Still others, like seed sown among thorns, hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. Others, like seed sown on good soil, hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop. Some 30, some 60, some 100 times what was sown. I promise you, we're almost done. Next slide. Just kidding. Was that the last slide? Oh, did I just not change the last? You're right, I didn't. I guess I didn't change the last verse. I read the verse at the bottom as I was reading it. Oh yeah, that's all I got down here. That's perfect. That's right where the parable ends. Great job. You made it. Congratulations. Hey, now this is a pretty common parable, right? We've all heard it. Most of us have heard it. Some have read it probably many times. It's one of those things, like a lot of us, we like to read through the Gospels of Mark, and we like to, or the Gospels in general. It's kind of our first go-to for some of us. And when you first hear it mentioned, or when I first hear it mentioned, I think of all of those sermons that I've heard about scattering seeds. And the approach that is generally taken is something of like, along the lines of, it's just our job to scatter the seeds. Some will fall on good soil, some will fall, well, not so good a soil. And we don't really have control of that. We just got to scatter the seeds. We got to pick up that bag of seeds and we just got to throw them everywhere. And wherever they land, that's okay. I'm not saying that that's how it's always been preached, but that's kind of the general consensus, is that it's our job to scatter the seeds and just let them fall where they fall. And while that's not entirely wrong, I don't think that's quite what Jesus is actually getting at here. And I want to kind of approach the whole parable from a little bit of a different perspective. First of all, I want to just set up kind of what's going on here in the book of Mark, all right? So if you you can kind of follow along. I'm going to highlight a few things that kind of just happen in chapter 2 and 3, because it's kind of crazy, and it's important to understand. It's important for us to understand the context of what's going on as Jesus is teaching his first parable here in the Gospel of Mark. Right at the beginning of chapter 2, I think it is, that you see that Jesus heals this guy with leprosy. All right. What we're going to notice over these 2 chapters is that he was getting himself into some trouble, right? Like Jesus typically does, typical Jesus fashion. He got himself into some trouble. He heals a man with leprosy right off the bat. He then goes and he forgives and heals a paralyzed man. The Pharisees really didn't like that, right? Who does this guy think he is basically what they end up saying, is like, who is this guy? Who are you to forgive this guy's sins? And then he sits and he eats with tax collectors and sinners, and he gets called out for that. And then he's questioned for why his disciples aren't fasting while John's and the disciples of the Pharisees are. He gets called out for that. And then he heals on the Sabbath, which was a big no-no. The Pharisees really didn't like that. At this point, they're like, okay, how do we kill this guy? That's literally what happens. You can read it in chapter 3. He heals this guy on the Sabbath, and he's like, yeah. They're like, we were good with like healing a guy with leprosy. We were good with all that other stuff, but this is the Sabbath, Jesus, and you don't do that on the Sabbath. So we're going to kill you. That's basically what happens. That's kind of the starting point in the Gospel of Mark where they start to actually plot how they're going to kill this guy. And then he chills out a little bit. He appoints the 12 disciples. Thanks for that, Jesus. It's nice to see you not doing something that's actually just upsetting everybody. But then he's actually accused by a bunch of teachers of the law and family, and they were basically suggesting that he's possessed by the prince of demons. He has to be. How else can he be doing all this stuff? That's a lot of crazy stuff that happens in these 2 chapters. Right before Jesus starts to preach and starts to teach and starts to do this thing. But the reality is, all this stuff was taking place, and people were starting to notice this Jesus guy. People were starting to like, hey, this guy's crazy, first of all. He's doing some things that he shouldn't be doing. And they start to notice him, and they start listening to him, and they start gathering around, and they start coming in numbers. And that's where we find ourselves in this parable right here. We see that through it all, through all of these instances, Jesus begins to generate this crowd that's following him. And they're like, there is something different about this guy. We got to listen. Either he's completely crazy or he's something super special. And then we find out ourselves in this part of the story that we just read at the start of Mark chapter 4, that Jesus is standing in a boat because there's so many people on the crowds or on the shore. The crowds are so big, there's not even really room for him. So he's got to step out and he's got to get on a boat on his little stage. And I think it says that he's sitting in it and then just teaching, which he must have had a booming voice or something, or the like acoustics of down on the shore were just incredible, because I picture there just being so many people and Jesus getting into this boat and teaching. And the funny thing about the boat is actually, if you read in Mark chapter 3, I think it's verse 9, the boat was actually an escape plan, right? The boat, he actually tells his disciples to go get a boat ready, go get a small boat ready in case the crowds are too big. It's like Jesus is saying, like, homies, I need a boat because the paparazzi is going to be so bouncing right now this morning. Like, I've got such a big following that you guys, I need an escape plan. It's right. It's like the cab that like, or like that, you know, when a celebrity's got like that driver, or the president or so the prime minister, they got a driver ready to go. If something happens, like that boat, they're gone. They're in that car, they're gone. It's kind of funny. It's just humorous. But it does say in Mark chapter 3, verse 9, that Jesus got them to get the boat to keep the people from crowding him. And then we get into this verse, and he sets it up, and Jesus starts off this sermon or this instruction, the very first parable that he says in Mark chapter 4. He starts off by saying, listen. Listen. That's a very important word in this parable, and I think it's actually a very important word to set up all of the parables that he's about to preach. He says, listen. Often when we try to look into a parable and try to pull out what Jesus is trying to say here, we're trying to determine what all the little details are meaning, what he's getting at, what he's hinting at. We get, and often we can do that. Some parables are easier to do that with than others. This one, he actually says it twice, so it's even a little bit easier to do that. He further explains what he's saying, and it's pretty obvious. But the question that I want to ask this morning, or the angle that I'm sort of looking at this parable from, is simply more like, why is this the parable that Jesus is starting with? Why is Jesus using this parable? Not necessarily what it says, because there's a lot of different interpretations for parables, just like there's a lot of different interpretations for Bibles. That's why we have like 100,000 different kinds of churches in the world today, right? We've all disagreed on something in the Bible at some point, and that's led us to split into do different things. We can interpret it a lot of different ways, but the question I want to ask this morning is, why is Jesus using this particular parable to start in this particular spot? And I think right from the start, we get a very clear hint, and that is simply, listen. Listen. Can you go back to that start there? Is that the start? There we go. No, next slide. There you go. Just kidding, one more. Is that the end? There we go, we see this. Listen, a farmer went out to sow seed. We're just gonna kind of read this parable a little bit again. A farmer went out to sow his seeds. Next slide. As he was scattering the seed, some of it fell along the path, and the birds came up and he ate it. Some fell in rocky places where they didn't have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow, but when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and withered because they had no root. Other seeds fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, 60, 100 times. But then Jesus said, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. So Jesus is obviously referring to the words that he is going to be speaking. It's not a far stretch to get that out of this thing. And he kind of like reiterates that in the second half of this verse, but he's talking about these seeds, the word of God, that are going to be falling on every different thing. He's basically saying that there's going to be a bunch of different ways that people are going to interpret my words, right? He's saying that there's going to be different ways that people are going to hear me, right? And he uses this illustration and he says, this is the illustration that I actually want to use. And then the disciples still have questions about it. He says it and he says all of these different things. Like there's going to be different soils, there's going to be different ways that people receive the words that I actually have to say. And the disciples are still kind of like, so what's up with these parables, man? What's up with these parables? And then he reiterates and he's like, guys, if you, and this is I think a really important line of this particular passage, but he basically says, if you don't understand this parable, how will you understand any parable? What he's getting at is actually how people are hearing, how people are listening. That Jesus is actually setting this whole thing up. He's starting with this parable because he's saying, how you hear and how you listen and how you receive things that are given to you is actually going to affect how you hear and how you listen to every other parable that I preach. He's very intentionally using this one in this particular gospel to say, hey, we need to be better hearers. If you guys want to get this, if you guys want to understand the kingdom of heaven, which is essentially what most parables are pointing to, then you got to learn how to listen. Right? You got to learn how to listen. And there's a bunch of different kind of listeners. Some of you are going to hear what I have to say, Jesus is saying, and you're going to take it and it's going to fall on really good soil. And it's going to change your life and it's going to cause you to live in a completely different way. And others, well, not so much. He says, though, you basically have to figure out how to listen, and that is going to be super important if you want to understand how you are to live this life. If you want to understand what the kingdom of heaven is like, if you want to come and follow me, and you got to remember, he's talking to a group of people that are just starting to follow him, right? They're just starting to figure this out. If you want to do this, then you got to learn to listen. You got to learn to listen well. So there's a lot of different things that we can take out of this parable this morning. There's a lot of different angles that you can do. You can go down this road there's a lot of different things that we could emphasize. But I think that what I want to pull out for myself and what I hope you can glean from this morning is two simple thoughts. Maybe not so simple. I'll try to explain them. The second one's more so. The first one is this: we need to be better hearers. We need to be better listeners. We need to be better at listening to people in all aspects of our life, in our work lives, in our family relationships, in our conversations. We need to be better at listening in our walk with Jesus. We need to be better at listening what God is saying or trying to say to us through scripture, through our prayer life, through somebody else that is maybe speaking to us. Maybe it's a prophetic conversation, or maybe it's just a simple conversation that you're having with somebody at the grocery store. We need to be better listeners. We need to be better at hearing what God is saying. We need to figure out which soil we are. We need to figure out, is this soil that we have in our life going to be rich and able to hear what people are saying and what God is saying to us? And I know this parable is speaking more specifically about the word of God falling on certain things, but I think there's just some general principles that we can pull out here and say that we need to be better listeners, that I want to be a good listener in every aspect of my life. I want to hear what people are actually saying. In church, you need to be a better listener when you're falling asleep when Pastor Scott's preaching. In all of this, we need to check our hearts. We need to ask ourselves, are we hearing well? Are we good soil? Are we one of those things that when people speak to us, we're actually attentive in the moment, or are we thinking about the other 1,000 things that we got going on in our lives? Are we waiting so that when you get that little vibe? This is honestly one of the stupidest things I've ever bought. Because now not only do I get notifications on my phone, I just get them on my watch when I'm not even like looking at my phone or even in, and it's just constantly, I could be standing there face to face and having a conversation with you and my watch could be buzzing and it's like, oh, what is happening right now? And so we often get so distracted. We live in everybody knows this. The reality is there's more distractions in our world than there ever has been. Right? Like we are so overwhelmed with distractions and we get so caught up in what's the latest thing happening, who's talking to us, who's trying to get a hold of us, why isn't anybody texting, or whatever that situation is. We're so distracted by the million things. We're living in a super busy culture. And that's a sermon for another day. I'm reading a book right now called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And it's by a guy named John Mark Comer, probably my favorite pastor writer. But he basically argues that busyness is the number one problem in the world today. Like it's the root of all other problems. If you're interested in that, once I'm done with it, you can read it. It's an amazing. I'm only about halfway through it, and it's so good so far. That's a completely side topic, but the reality is we have so much going on that we're actually not very good listeners sometimes. At least I'm not. I catch myself all the time being like, in a conversation and oft in left field. And we just got to be better at that. We got to be better. But the other thing is this. The second thing is this. First thing is we need to be better hearers. The second thing is we need to recognize that not everyone will hear us in the same way or as we are intending to be heard. Okay? I could say something right here, right now. I could get up and make a blanket statement right here. And everybody in this room, most of us might hear it. If I say the sky is blue, most of us will agree with that. But some people will have completely tuned out for this particular instance, or some people will just have a different worldview or a different starting point that will cause them to actually think something completely different, that there are different kinds of soils in this room. And this is really big for me. This is a thought that has been rolling through my mind for a long time, probably about the last year, and I think it's really kind of relates to this, that perception, so what somebody perceives of me or what I'm saying, will trump the intentions when it comes to determining somebody else's reality. I could get up here and I could mean to be saying one thing. My heart could be burning with this one particular topic and I could say it in this particular way. But how you perceive it is all that matters when it comes to the reality of what I said. My intentions mean squat. If you walk around trying to be the nicest guy in the world, if you think you're being the nicest person ever, but you come across as a jerk and people perceive you to be a jerk, guess what? You're a jerk. Right? It doesn't matter what your intentions are. And that's a hard truth. That's a reality that I think I've just realized in my life, is that perception trumps intentions when it comes to determining some reality. Let me give you an example of this. We had an election a couple weeks ago. Most of us know that, hey? Most of us voted, hopefully. Politics is one of those areas where it's like this whole perception versus perception versus intention sort of idea really is clear for me. Because the reality is, a lot of us in here have very different worldviews. And a lot of us in here come and then we approach something in one particular way, and when we hear something from somebody else, when we hear what any of the particular leaders is saying or on a particular subject or on anything else, we actually perceive it in a certain way, right? And an X leader could say this, and this person over here will perceive it in one way, and this person over here will perceive it in the other way. This person might think that is the best idea that anybody has ever spoken ever, and this person would be like, this guy should be murdered. Like there, you could go either way. I have no idea. But the reality is, we perceive things different, and I don't think that is ever more clear than it is in politics. Than it is in politics. We bring so much baggage, we bring so many things to the table that when we hear somebody say something, we actually just hear what we perceive it to be, and we have no idea, or we give zero time to what the intentions of that person said were. Right? Here's the funny thing about politics, and I'm not saying this to be controversial or anything, but the reality is, I think that every leader thinks that what they're saying or doing is actually a good intention. They just come from such a different worldview that we just disagree with that, right? It's not like leaders in politics, at least most of them, are looking to make the world a worse place, right? They all think they're doing what is good. And they get out and they say this thing, and they will say something, their intentions will be good. Their intentions will be what it is. And our perception of it actually changes the reality of who they are because of the things that they're saying. Let me take this analogy one step further. I just spent 3 minutes talking about politics in church. And for some of you in this room, that is going to affect your perception of this sermon. Right? Some people aren't going to like it. But my intentions were never to upset you by speaking out about politics. My intentions were to give you a different perspective of something. And the reality is, I didn't share anything about a political view or anything else, but the word politics came into the room, and that is actually going to affect the perception that you had of this sermon. And I'm not trying to be edgy here. I'm trying to make an illustration. The reality is, we need to be better listeners. That's the first thing. But we need to understand how people are listening to us and what kind of playing grounds that they are coming from. I think that Jesus is actually doing this in this parable. He's intentionally starting off all of his parables by saying that, hey, if you want to understand parables, if you can't even understand this one, then how are you going to understand any of them? If you want to understand what I'm going to say to you, and remember, he's talking to a particular group at a particular time. He's saying, if you want to get this, if you want to be doing this, then you need to be a better listener. And what he's actually doing by doing that is he's preparing the ground that he's going to be speaking to. He's saying, hey, I'm not going to just get up and start by saying, this is how everything unfolds. He's actually saying, no, hey, this is how you need to receive something if you want to grow, if you want to begin to understand. He's preparing the ground. So what he's doing in doing this is he's recognizing that not everybody that he's going to be talking to is actually going to hear the words that he says in the same way. And he's doing that, and he's saying, hey, I'm going to be cautious by that, and I'm going to just give you this illustration to at least start you to think about how you receive something. He's not going to force everybody to listen to him in the same way. He's not going to say something and expect that everybody has to get the exact meaning out of it. If he wanted to make really crystal clear points, I don't think he would have used parables. They can be kind of confusing sometimes, but the reality is he's doing this very intentionally because he recognizes that the people that he's going to be speaking to are not going to hear him in the same way. So he's at least being a little bit intentional of trying to create that level playing ground. The two big things I pull out of this sermon or this parable from this particular aspect is that we need to be better hearers. We have to be. But we need to recognize that not everyone will hear us in the same way. And we need to do something about that in the sense that we need to at least speak with our words being super intentional, right? One of the hardest things to do as a pastor, and I feel bad for Pastor Scott having to do this every single week, is preach on a Sunday morning. And it's easy for some people, it's difficult for some people, but the reality is there are things that I could say this morning or that you may have been listening to this entire thing, but you got stuck up on one line. And that will skew the whole thing of this morning, right? And so we as pastors try to do our best to kind of throw something out there that's going to be the most effective for the most amount of people. Right? We have to put that work in. We can't just be preaching to one particular aspect of the congregation or one particular demographic of the congregation. But the reality is We need to be cautious of how we're presenting our words is so that people aren't going to take them out of context, so that people aren't going to get hurt by them, or we want the church to be an uplifting place. And I promise you, this message isn't trying to beat you up and say that you're a horrible listener, but it's to hopefully get you to start pondering how you are doing at that aspect of your life. We have conversations with people every single day. We do this on a daily basis. And the question that I have been having to ask myself this week is, am I actually a good listener? And because I'm having to force myself to do that, I've been pondering how I'm saying things so that recognizing when other people are coming from different worldviews or different playing grounds, that they might not hear me exactly as I'm intending them to hear me, and I gotta talk in a way that will hopefully allow for people to kind of get what I'm saying, right? Regardless of what my intentions were, people's perception of my intentions will trump that. Are you riding with me this morning? Is it kind of confusing? If it is, I'm sorry. I'll talk to you later about it. I'd love you to shoot me an email. If you love this sermon, if you hate this sermon, either way, that's okay. But the reality is, I believe that God is saying to me this morning, and hopefully you're feeling the same way, is that we need to be better listeners. We need to be better listeners in our workplace, in our family dynamics. We need to be better listeners in our homes. I read a study this week that said that these phones, these things, and don't get me wrong, we all know that these aren't great things, that they're a good tool, but they're a super negative thing, that these phones, the damage that they're having on children because of how their parents are using them is ridiculous. It's through the roof. Are we able to listen to our children when they're talking to us? Or are these things becoming a distraction? Or is something else a distraction? We get so caught up, and then we maybe get home and it's been a long day and we're just exhausted and everything else. But there's these kids want our attention, and are we giving it to them? Are we listening to them well? Or are other things getting in the way and making us bad listeners? It's a little bit of just a side point, but it's something that really stood out to me this week. That we've got some stuff in our life. Are we good listeners? Are we actually in the moment all the time? And are we doing our best to make sure that the words that we're speaking and the things that we're saying are landing on solid ground, on quality ground? Are we, not that we have to fix everything, we can only do so much. I want you to hear that this morning, that we can only do so much. There's only so much that we can do. We can't make everybody think the way we think. We can't make everybody align with our views. There's only so much we can do, and I'm not saying that we should fix everybody. But the reality is we should at least recognize that when we're talking to anybody, that they're probably coming from a different starting point, that they're probably coming from a different worldview, and that needs to affect how we speak our words. And Jesus, it affected Jesus' words, because he recognized that people aren't going to necessarily receive me super well, so I'm going to use this parable to start the series of parables that I'm about to go on to say, hey, you guys need to be better listeners if you're going to get a glimpse of the kingdom of heaven. That's kind of what I think this parable, that's kind of why I think this parable is used in this moment. Let's pray and let's get out of here. Let's go have lunch. God, we love you. And we're grateful that we get to be a part of this family, a part of this church. And God, we thank you that we can glean something from your word, that you've spoken a couple thousand years ago and a number of years before that. That God, there's life in this text. There's something different about it from all other texts that I've read. And God, we are just grateful that we get to do this as a family. And I pray that as we go through our week this week, we would be cautious of those moments where we're in conversation and we're distracted by something else that's going on. May we be good hearers. May we be good listeners. And God, may we also be cautious of the times when we're saying, may we recognize that people are at different points. That people might have maybe they've had a horrible week. And there's just some other things going on in their life, and they might not be able to hear what we're saying in that particular thing, as simple or as complex as it might be. God, we're grateful that we get to do this. We're grateful that we get to be in this family, that we get to do life with each other, but may we be continually growing to become better humans and ultimately more like you, Jesus. So may we be good listeners. May we just really communicate well also because of that, because we recognize that people are at different points. Thank you for this parable. Thank you that you still speak through Scripture. God, we love you. We're grateful for today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I hope you have the best week ever. Hey, if you are a young adult, we've got a young adult service happening the first Wednesday of every month here at the church, 7:30. We'd love to see you there. If you're anywhere, somewhere in the 20-ish area kind of thing. Come talk to me if you think you're interested in that. We'd love that. Anything else? We good? All right. Have a great Sunday. Enjoy your week.